Metaphysics, Authority, and Modern Delusion. The rise of the modern world is coeval with the establishment of scientific metaphysics, or metaphysics possessing a formally incontrovertible certainty grounded in the self-certainty of a Cartesian-like ego or self. In pre-modern ages, we have metaphysics in the plural, and the most prestigious metaphysics would be Aristotle's. What was meant by metaphysics? In its essence, metaphysics was knowledge, scientia, episteme, of being qua being, of being in and of itself, of what it means to be, of the destiny of all beings, of ultimate finality. What was meant by knowledge here? Certainty illuminated by reflection. No mere imaginative, tentative, hypothetical speculation, but a certainty produced through a reflective turn of the imagination upon its ground. A certainty arising out of the ground of imagination itself. Evidently, metaphysical knowledge could not be reduced to linguistic formulas representing it. Arising from the very ground of human consciousness, metaphysical knowledge would allow the metaphysician to represent that ground authoritatively, or in such a way as to make more sense to the common man than competing representations. Metaphysical knowledge would not be knowledge cut off from ordinary human experience, but knowledge helping us see light in the dark, order in apparent disorder, if only at the risk of inducing people to mistake metaphysical formulations for order itself, or natural order. Hence, the pre-modern habit of emphasizing the provisional or poetic character of all metaphysical formulations. Scientific metaphysics was yet to be invented, and for good reasons. Classical, pre-modern, or pre-scientific metaphysical knowledge is never a knowledge to be applied to solve our ordinary problems, but knowledge allowing us to retrace our ordinary problems to eternal spheres of understanding, of illumination, of awakening. Metaphysical knowledge would be, in its essence, the perfection of all knowledge, entailing a communion of knower, and so of the impulse to know, and subject matter of knowledge. While other modes of knowledge objectify their subject matter, metaphysical knowledge pertains altogether to the inner life of its subject matter, to its essential nature or principle of generation. Metaphysical knowledge is then, properly speaking, genuine understanding. Can genuine understanding be communicated? In what sense might it be transmitted? If it cannot be reduced to any formula of words, it can nonetheless produce a speech that guides us, our imagination, to face the obstacles to genuine understanding. Such a speech is above all metaphysical in the respect that it presents the irreducibility of the subject matter of all knowledge to objects subject to consumption or use. Metaphysical knowledge produces a metaphysical discourse defending the irreducibility of ends to means. Now let us consider modern metaphysics, or the modern reinvention of metaphysics. It takes its bearings not from being itself, but from a Cartesian-like self or ego. That ego appeals at once to being or God to justify itself. God as mask of the ego's will, as means to establish the authority of the modern self. It takes a while before the mask melts down as a result of the progressive success of the new metaphysics, but by the 19th century, the mask is off. Descartes' God is officially dead. Kant's ideal is publicly exposed as an idol. Metaphysics as a whole is formally debunked, or, to speak more politely, reduced to speculative discourse, conceived strictly nominalistically in the context of an intellectual history, or as a mere branch of knowledge, among others. Descartes makes academically explicit and respectable Machiavelli's rejection of the authority of past philosophers. The authority of the past is not worth anything insofar as it was not scientifically grounded. A new ground of authority must be sought in the analytical self-grasping of consciousness in terms of a self, found in the act of transforming its material world through controlled assimilation. The new self must become a higher self by incorporating soulless nature or res extensa. The consciousness of a self lost in the world must use its world to establish a world consciousness, or a world order that, rather than being lost in nature, owns or masters it. Human consciousness is reinvented through a provisional effacing of the essential difference between human and beastly consciousness. Man is treated essentially as a beast, a lowest common denominator. Human consciousness is but one determination of consciousness among others, one that happens to be susceptible to being flattered into identifying itself with thought itself. Hence Descartes' cogito ergo sum, suggesting that the self's authority is confirmed absolutely as repository of thought itself. Thought, or consciousness, resolves itself in its determination, albeit, as seen, a provisional, formal determination is to be distinguished from a fully evolved, historically mediated determination coinciding with a world consciousness in which all men should partake as moments of historical consciousness. Modern man is then historical man, or man defined by his sense of history, his certainty of belonging to a struggle for freedom, for the emergence of freedom as the triumph of world consciousness. But where do we find world consciousness? We find it incarnated in the institutions characteristic of a global or open society, a society in which all problems, all questions, find their solution in and as the consolidation of the open society itself. In the open society, we are consequently raised to treat all problems as technical problems, to treat all problems technically or in technical amoral terms. Problems solvable or redeemable in terms of an overarching world spirit, Hegel's Weltgeist. Ordinary problems are our res extensa, material that acquires meaning only through our work, by our converting it into a world order that we are to serve as historically conscious beings, being responsible for that order, responsible to attend to that planetary order as a new technologically mediated nature. Through the new historical man, or masses of centers of historical consciousness, a new world order is to emerge as consummate repository of freedom, beyond all traditional metaphysics, even as metaphysics is retained in terms of intellectual discourse or verbiage rooted in evolving historical consciousness. Wherever such a consciousness is fully evolved, metaphysics, no less than any traditional religion, is supposed to yield to a world or universal spirituality a freedom that is one with the world and of which technology must be the primary incarnation or expression, where technology is the way through which res extensa is ordered in terms of res cogitans, the way through which we can achieve collectively the modern or consummate alchemic transformation of material means into spiritual ends. Modern alchemy presupposes that our material means are devoid of any substantive spiritual ends prior to and independently of any so-called historical development. Aside from modern man's new or scientific world order, all spiritual ends are found merely in name or as abstract concepts, ideals begging for a historical realization. History is the arena through which a synthesis can emerge between material means and formal or imaginary ends. History as consciousness's struggle to realize ends. But now, let us return to a classical, pre-modern conception of means and ends. Classical metaphysics pertains to substantive ends at work in all means, not in terms of a mere logic, but in terms of what is more fittingly named divine providence, namely, the agency of spirit or mind in the ordering of means back to itself. The agency in question is presented traditionally, even canonically, as a kenotic one, insofar as it entails the entering of spirit or light in matter or darkness to return to itself, on the way or temporally producing life forms partaking in the fullness of spirit. Beings are then presented as gifts or creatures of a divine author entering eternally in himself by emptying himself outside of himself, or to be more precise, by generating a place of participation in the fullness of divine being, since there is no such thing as non-being or uninformed matter. There is no realization of divine being where divine being is eminently real, ens realissimum, to begin with, not merely formally, as in the context of Kant's critiques, but really or substantively. Yet again, the objective for our pre-modern classics is not to establish the empire of God over all lesser beings, but to testify to the preeminence of the perfection of being over imperfect being, and to the capacity of imperfect being to ascend to the fullness of being, finding therein eternal redemption from imperfection. Such a capacity would require the agency of perfect being in the constitution of imperfect being, or the immanence of substantive spiritual ends in material means. Now, such an inherence of transcendence in the immanent tells us that we are not historical beings, to speak with our times, but beings who are accidentally in this world while being essentially of God, or destined, called to transcend our world. The Platonic orientation of life, against which modern man as such rebels, calls for the metaphysical representation of spiritual ends as more fundamental than any logic of development of means, or even of any full realization of such a logic. Platonism's ens realissimum represents the Alpha and Omega, within which finite consciousness is redeemed originally, a metaphysical unity that defines our finitude as mortality, and so in kenotic terms, whereby to be fully or humanly finite is to imitate the kenotic agency of divine being, gathering means into presupposed ends, not to mistake our creations for our ends, but to forge means as signs testifying to properly divine ends, ends naturally reflected in the means we forge. Such are the artifacts, the products of art, in which our finite consciousness is given to gather nature, sacrificing nature back to the God who sacrifices himself in nature to begin with. Modern man receives a divine gift only to forget the giver, living as if we could use the gift to establish a world originally devoid of giver, or a world that creates its own giver. Following the lesson articulated by the serpent in Eden, modern man seeks God in the apotheosis of human creations, creations in which man is supposed to find his own redemption. Since our creations are no longer conceived platonically as imitations of divine creations, we are left intuiting them as the expression of collectively realized individuals. Our ultimate realization is to be found in our collective creation, our Tower of Babel, scientifically empowered to account critically for all ancient denunciations of human hubris. Modern man's scientific or universal method is to guarantee systematicity and exactitude in the transformation of the world as it is given to us into a world in which we are at once creators or saviors and saved ones, a world in which man saves himself from his own limitations by converting his limitations into his foremost assets. Our scientific method both lowers and raises man beyond ancient recommendations. It lowers man to the plane of a beast utterly deaf to divine intelligence, only to raise man through a symbolic logic to the role of God within a world presupposing the absence or death of God. Here, man can reinvent God as a metaphor for man's own creative powers, a symbol of our active imagination, or a hypothesis confirming the legitimacy of modern man's peculiar project to turn vice into a supreme virtue, our betrayal of the ens perfectissimum into the symbolic triumph of a symbolic God. How should we speak about God, then? As mask of our progressive apotheosis, or as true face eclipsed by all modern idealism, all attempts to realize ideals? A true face as soul, as voice speaking in the dark, as primordial call, calling us back to it by gathering our lives in a poetic form sacrificed to the primordial call, sanctified in memory of the giver of all gifts, testifying to the divine's active presence in the human. The modern drive to solve the conflict between good and evil, to settle the matter in favor of the allied forces of good, paladins of freedom for all, of universal integration, betrays loss of faith in properly divine redemption, in the ontological, absolute primacy of the good, beyond the limitations of experience, of what is contestable, contingent, revisable. The question is not fundamentally one we can settle. When left in our hands, the question of to be or not to be is but a mirror of absurdity. To be in the affirmation of one's will, or not to be, as in the affirmation of the negation of one's will. Yet, if the question is not up to us to solve, if the will is not our own, we are not in the position of either affirming or relinquishing it. The two alternatives, to be or not to be, will then point us to a concrete discrepancy between being itself and the all too human pretense of being, between a divine will beyond all non-being and the betrayal of that will in a realm of semblance, of alienation from the divine mode or way of being, this consisting of an uncompromising return to the understanding. Here, to be, is willing, as determination of unbound thought, in and out of itself. The key to the ring constituting the soul of poetry, as Shakespeare shows us most graciously.